Welcome. It is great to see you here. 20 years ago, I was paddling through a salt marsh, and I saw this hand sticking up, covered in mud. It was a human hand, and it was sticking out of the vegetation. I never would have thought 20 years ago I'd be telling this story, or 20 years back then that I would have encountered that. See, salt marshes are one of the most productive ecosystems in the world in terms of above-ground biomass, and it smells like sulfur. You can be right on top of something that's in the process of decay without noticing it, because everything around you smells like decay already. So I was there as a graduate student in one of the largest salt marshes in New England, studying the post-flood gene ecology of a species of bird that lives exclusively in salt marshes. Salt marshes are, as I said, incredibly productive habitat. They're grasslands. They get flooded twice a day in little bits of water. And humans have long fought war against tidal flow in salt marshes to drain them so that cattle can graze and they can be hayed, but also to drain them to prevent mosquitoes from breeding in there. If you go to a salt marsh, you'll see these parallel channels that humans have dug, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and for the last 200 years, in an attempt to drain these salt marshes. It doesn't work. It doesn't reduce mosquito populations. It's absolutely failed effort, but it put a lot of people to work back in a time when a lot of people needed jobs. But the remnants are that salt marshes have these systems of channels that are meant to drain water, to dry out the salt marshes as quickly as possible. So when I was doing my research out there, I'd be paddling up there in the main channels, the only places where there's water, and that's where I came upon this hand sticking out of the mud. And one of the other remnants that's important to keep in mind is that there's these channels, and then there are tidal gates positioned in the middle of these salt marshes. They're like miniature dams, and they are meant to block water from flowing into the marsh during high tides and to facilitate the removal of water quickly during low tides to drain the water out of the marsh, to dry it out quickly. Imagine a concrete tunnel 10 feet long and water shooting through it like a fire hydrant spigot if a firefighter turned on the spigot on your street. That is what these tidal gates are like during periods of high tide, when the water is fighting like heck to get into the salt marshes. They are dangerous places. And as someone who lived and worked in salt marshes for many years knows, you don't go anywhere near them. But for a common person out there paddling around, that might not be something you know about, how dangerous and how life-threatening they are. My field techs and I in our canoe came upon this tidal gate, and we saw the remnants of a kayak folded in half, wedged into the entrance of the tidal gate. And it was new because we'd been there every day. We knew every inch of that salt marsh, and we knew that something had just happened. We looked over and saw that hand sticking out of the mud, and the hand began to move. And it was attached to a human being, of course, who was alive and healthy and fine, but he was naked. As his kayak was sucked through the tidal gate, as he was inquisitively paddling too close against his, unbeknownst to him, the tidal gate began to pull his kayak through, folded it in half. He desperately reached out, grabbed a piece of rebar up above the tidal gate, held on desperately with both hands as the tidal water sucked his clothing and ripped his pants and shorts off of his body. He crawled himself out, was too exhausted from the ordeal to do anything except crumple into a ball, until us birders, out there doing our research, stumbled upon him and rescued him and paddled him down back to his house. He lived on the edge of the salt marsh. And that story 20-some years ago is a great introduction for tonight and our speaker's topic tonight, because it reminds me that you'll never know what you'll find in the water. My name is Jason Hill, and I am the long-term host of Suds and Science for the past 8 years, and it is so great to see everybody here. Thank you for being here tonight. Is this your first time to Suds and Science? Can I just get an idea? First time to Putnam's, anyone? Right on. What an amazing place. Thank you to Kelsey and team for being here, and thank you to Jam and Jordan from Jam behind the cameras for is our attempt to introduce you to the passions of scientists in a low-key format every month from January through May. This is not a lecture. It is a discussion, and it is meant to be engaged. And I invite you to ask questions throughout tonight's talk, and to lean in, to ask outside your comfort zone, and to leave tonight learning, having learned something that you didn't know about before. There's no PowerPoint. This is a discussion like someone's visiting you at your dinner table. I'm a quantitative ecologist. Again, my name is Jason Hill, and I work for the Vermont Center for Eco Studies right up the road here in White River Junction. It is our first time being here at Putnam's, and it is super exciting to be here, and I'm super excited to have you. If you would like to know anything more about Suds and Science, please check out our website. And there's the full list of schedule through the month of May, which is our last talk. Next month's talk is about ectomycorrhizal fungi and its importance in arboreal and forest and ecosystems. So I encourage you to check out the full schedule. Without any further ado, I'm super excited to have Dr. Celia Chen here tonight. And I'm going to turn it over. Can we give a warm round of applause for our first speaker of 2025, Dr. Celia Chen.
Sorry, I have to do the technology thing. So many things. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming out tonight. I just can't believe how many people are here. And I see lots of friends and familiar faces, so thank you. I'm actually on the VCE board too, and so it is a great organization. I'm a little biased, I admit, but like Jason and Ryan Rebozo back here, really great scientists in this organization, and that's why I love being around them. I am not a conservation ecologist. I am an ecologist, though. I work at Dartmouth. I teach classes like marine biology and coral reef ecology, but I do a lot of research on contaminants in water, and I think that's what it says on the blurb, so that's hopefully what you're here to hear about. So I just wanted to say that I would love for this to be very kind of spontaneous and people asking questions as I'm talking, because waiting is kind of, you don't ever really get back to that area of the topic. So please jump in, ask questions, raise your hand if you want to, but you don't have to. So I'd love for it to just be very open. I will do a little bit of storytelling, maybe sort of how I got here and some of the things that we do and what we know about aquatic systems and some of the contaminants that I work on. But first, I just want to say that it all started in New Jersey. I am from New Jersey. I used to be very embarrassed to say that, but there are others of us from New Jersey who live and feel very grateful to live in this beautiful area. But when I was in New Jersey growing up in the 50s and 60s, my parents had immigrated from China, and we lived in New Jersey, and there were no Chinese grocery stores in New Jersey at all. Not in the 50s and 60s. There's many now, but not then. And every several weeks, we would get on the New Jersey Turnpike and go into New York City through the Holland Tunnel and go buy our Chinese groceries in Chinatown. And on the way into New York City, if you've ever been on the New Jersey Turnpike, you know that there is a lot of industry there. And at that time, there were lots of oil refineries, there were chemical plants, there were many, many future Superfund sites. Superfund sites are the contaminated sites that the US has been for decades trying to clean up, many along that corridor. And I would be riding in the back of that station wagon knowing that something was really terribly wrong here. This just did not look right. And right around that same time, Silent Spring, Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring. And that was in the early 60s. And by that time, I think by the end of the 60s, I was probably reading books like that. And it so resonated with me, like something is really wrong. I should say that the very sites that I was driving past as a toddler and elementary school kid ended up being sites where I ended up working about 10 years ago. And so I actually really know with data that something is terribly wrong. I didn't know at the time, I just knew it smelled bad, it looked bad, it was just something that I felt like we had to fix somehow. So during the next decade, the 70s, as you may all know, is when we had all this environmental legislation come along, which was amazing. I mean, that was a decade of really when the US was really trying to fix things. The Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which had to do a lot with cleaning up sites and with hazardous chemicals in the environment. The Toxic Substances and Control Act, which is all about trying to protect us from all those toxic chemicals that we manufacture everywhere. The FIFRA, which is the one for in pesticides and rodenticides. And so there was all this great legislation that came out in the 70s. And that's when I and some of my classmates here we graduated from college. And that was when I figured out, this is the time to do something. There's legislation, there's science, enough science to know that we have a problem. And so that's what I figured out I should really do work at the interface of science and policy, environmental science and policy. And so, go forward to another decade or so and a few science degrees and policy jobs, I have ended up working in the area of contaminants in water. And not so much drinking water, but in water in which animals, wildlife reside and live and feed. And it's been a really interesting journey and interesting area to be working on, but also sometimes a little depressing. And so I wanted to just tell you about a couple of the pollutants that I work on, because I think they really kind of are related to a lot of the things that we do. I mean, none of these chemicals end up in these environments without our help as humans. And so there are things that we do that increase that presence in the environment. And so there are things we can do to help reduce that. So we'll get to that eventually at the end. But I wanted to talk about two different contaminants that are pretty ubiquitous these days. One of them is mercury, and you might have heard about, mercury in our fillings. Those of you who have had fillings from at least my era, we all have mercury amalgam in our fillings, but we also have mercury that actually ends up coming from things like coal and burning coal. And we also get mercury from things like, it gets into the environment from things like mining and metal smelting and all those kinds of things. So one of them is mercury, and the other is the more recent, very famous contaminant called PFAS, or the forever chemical. You might have heard it called that, or the Teflon chemical. And so we'll talk about both of those. So first, any questions before I go on? Okay, so a lot of years ago, we started to study mercury because we had a toxic metals program at Dartmouth that lasted for like 27 years. It was pretty amazing, and we were funded for a long time to study mercury. And what we were coming to find out, this started in the 90s, and in the 80s, how did we first find out that mercury was a problem? Well, some of you might have heard of the Mad Hatter of Alice in Wonderland. Those Mad Hatters were not mad, they all were suffering from neurotoxicity because they had been exposed to inorganic mercury. Inorganic mercury was used in the making of hats, felting. And so these people were highly exposed to mercury. Mercury is a neurotoxin. It affects the brain and the central nervous system, and it causes tremors. It causes the inability to walk or to see or speak or move in a normal way. And so these hatters were getting, poisoned, basically. The next time we started to learn more about the really bad effects of mercury was from Minamata Bay in Japan. I don't know if you've ever, there's actually a Johnny Depp movie that is about, it's a biographical movie about the life photographer who made that whole catastrophe public to the world. Because at that time there was a plastics factory that was dumping mercury into Minamata Bay, which is a very large body of water. And that bay, all of those people subsisted on fishing and seafood. And at first, they saw that these cats, the cats that were always getting the extra fish, were going, just becoming crazy and then dying. They didn't know what this was about. And eventually, enough mercury ended up in that system that the human population was really severely affected. So one of the photographs that this photographer, and I've forgotten his name, took that is very famous actually, is of a mother holding her very deformed daughter as she's bathing her. I don't know if you've ever seen this photo. It's a black and white photo. It's incredibly powerful. But that was because the mother, when this baby was in utero, had been, eating fish just like everybody else, had then exposed the fetus and her young daughter to mercury. So, that was in the early 1960s. Yeah, so I think the movie actually is called Minamata. I actually had the chance to see it in Geneva when I was at the Minamata Convention. So the Minamata Convention is the international treaty on mercury. And so they actually premiered that movie there. And so it tells that story. But it was in the early 1960s. Now the company, I think it's called Chizo, plastics manufacturing, would not own up to that, the connection between their pollutants for decades. I mean, this is classic, right? The industry doesn't want to be responsible for all of this human health, public health catastrophe. So that was when people realized that exposure from fish consumption in polluted areas is a really big problem. Then in about the 80s, there was a study done by a master's student at the University of Maine on bald eagles. And that's when they realized that eagles, because they're top predators, were eating fish and other things, but mostly fish, that actually exposed the eagles to a lot of mercury. Since then, one of my other colleagues has worked on common loon and has done a lot of studies on common loons and found in the state of New Hampshire and the state of Maine, it's something like 12% are exposed to high levels of mercury because they eat at the top of the aquatic food chain. So one of the things that's important to know here is that mercury biomagnifies in the food chain. So what that means is that it's taken up at the very base, plankton, and then eaten by a smaller fish that are eaten by larger fish, which are eaten by really large fish, and then eaten by humans and other, what we call piscivores, fish eaters. And so the amount of methylmercury, which is the form that keeps getting biomagnified as you go up the food chain, just keeps getting higher in concentration in these organisms. So when we eat a lot of top predator species, we actually get more exposed to mercury. So that's why loons eat only fish. Fish get mercury even from the most pristine places. So I'll talk more about that in a second. So I already told you it's a neurotoxin. It causes developmental effects in children. So pregnant women and children are considered to be the most at-risk population. So there are fish consumption advisories for how much fish you should eat if you are a pregnant woman or a child. and it's lower than what the general population should eat because of the mercury exposure. It's really something that many physicians don't know that much about. I had the chance to get to know just briefly the CEO of IMAX, who actually became a real kind of, he donated like $1 million to the State University of New York, Stony Brook, because they had a group of scientists studying mercury. And he did not know, but he thought he was being so healthy, eating tuna sushi every day, 7 days a week. And over time, this guy was super healthy. He always ran and played tennis. He could not even run anymore. The doctors didn't know what it was about. It turned out that he had mercury toxicity, and he was having all those neurological problems that come from having that toxin in your system. And eventually, once he realized, he stopped eating, and it does go back down, but you can store it in your body for a long time. But he was just wanting people to continue to do research and for physicians to know about this, because they just didn't know what was wrong with him. So there are anecdotes of those kinds of situations. If you remember, there used to be tuna fish, canned tuna, and we still have canned tuna, and whether there's mercury in them or not. So I'll tell you this small fact. If you like tuna fish, canned tuna fish, albacore, which is a higher trophic level tuna species, bigger fish species, it has 3 times the concentration of mercury than the chunk light. Now, I happen to like chunk light, so that's okay. But just if you want to reduce your mercury exposure, yeah, you ought to think about that. So anyway, the area of research that we have always been doing is, well, like, where is it high in fish? Is it high in systems that are right next to factories or mines, or is it high in areas that are near chemical plants? Well, so we went out and did studies to look at mercury in fish in lakes throughout the Northeast. And boy, were we surprised, because as it turned out, the mercury was actually highest in the most pristine lakes. So the lakes where loons live, because of the biogeochemistry of mercury and the way it gets biomagnified up the food chain. So interestingly, lakes that have lots of humans, lots of cottages, lots of nutrient runoff, where you have lots of algal blooms, those actually had much lower mercury in the fish. And it turned out that it was because the algae actually kind of took it up and diluted it across all of that algae. We call it biodilution. And so here we had these results that showed that all those beautiful tea-stained lakes in New Hampshire and Maine are actually the lakes that have the highest mercury in fish. The ones where we fish, the ones where the loons live, all of that are actually the ones that have the highest mercury. Yes?
How about lobster?
Lobster actually hasn't been studied all that much, but the tamale can have some higher concentrations than the muscle tissue. You're right that they are predatory, but they actually aren't as predatory. They eat things off the bottom. So another thing we learned was that things that eat things in the food chain that's in the water, as opposed to the bottom and the mud, have higher concentrations. Yeah?
So if the mercury in some of those pristine lakes is higher because there isn't the algae to kind of deflate it a bit,
Yeah.
where is it originally coming from?
Yeah, I was just realizing I didn't tell you that. Yeah. So most of the mercury that has ended up in these very pristine places, like our beautiful lakes, as well as in the Arctic and the Antarctic, is atmospherically transported there from other places. And the places that have the biggest sources in developed countries are places that have a lot of coal-fired plants.
Does that stuff come from Ohio?
Yeah, so did you ever hear that? So in the Northeast, when we were studying, this was mostly in the 90s and the early 2000s when we were studying mercury, there was this, and it has been shown that the mercury that we get, especially up in northern Maine and in New Hampshire, actually is coming up from the Ohio Valley, the river valley, where there's a lot of industry, thank you. And so that's been done through modeling, through people who study atmospheric transport, through people, from people who are studying source attribution. There are ways to measure mercury in different things, tissues or in sediments or in water, where the stable isotopes of mercury tell you, well, does this come from coal fire burning, or does it come from the atmosphere, or does it come from a local source that's releasing into the water? So people know a lot about mercury at this point. And it comes from coal-fired plants in developed countries. It also, globally, the largest source of mercury to the atmosphere is something called artisanal small-scale gold mining. And that actually happens all over the developing world. And it is happening in very small operations. These are not like South Africa mines gold in these really big mines. This is small villages, and the people who mine are actually exposed to a lot of inorganic mercury. They eat the fish that ends up having a lot of methylmercury. The methylmercury, inorganic mercury thing matters because methylmercury is the form of mercury. It has a carbon attached to it that is biomagnified the most. And it is also the one that crosses the blood-brain barrier, it crosses the placenta, so it has other characteristics that the inorganic mercury doesn't have. But people who are exposed occupationally, they're exposed to inorganic mercury, and they can end up with all of the Mad Hatter syndrome that we mentioned earlier. Yeah, Tom?
Is it still thought to be the case that in the lakes in the Northeast that most of the methyl mercury is generated in bogs and areas around the lakes? Is that still?
It is, yeah. So Tom's question was whether most of the methyl mercury in lakes in our region are actually, it's created or transformed from inorganic mercury in bogs and wetlands. And that is most likely true because it's all of those aquatic systems that have wetlands associated with them that actually have higher concentrations in the fish. And that's because the inorganic mercury that goes up into the atmosphere from those coal-fired plants, from those mines, it ends up depositing, and it is converted to methyl mercury in low oxygen environments. And so in mud, right, in lakes and places like that, you have very low oxygen, and the bacteria that are in those places are the ones that are able to convert inorganic mercury into methyl mercury by attaching carbons to it, basically. And so, yeah, Mary.
So does that mean as a swimmer in the water that your exposure that way is dangerous?
Not really. The thing is that the concentrations in these lakes that we study or in the ocean is so low. It's so low that we're always worried about contaminating our samples. It's really because of this biomagnification that it ends up being so high in fish. So it's not so much, and so drinking water, mercury is not a drinking water contaminant as many others are, like lead and arsenic and now PFAS. But mercury is not really, the exposure route is not through water, drinking water. So those are the two main sources, but smelting, metal smelting, cement manufacturing is also a source. So we have something in the US called the MATS rule, Mercury and Air Toxic Standards. We should all be paying attention because Trump is about to come into office, and when he was in office last time, he tried to take the MATS rule down, which was because he wanted to be able to allow coal-fired plants not to have to remove the mercury from their stacks. And with a lot of effort on the part of many mercury scientists and people at various NGOs. That didn't happen. But, one never knows how these things will change in the next 4 years. So anyway, did you have another question, Tom?
I was just going to comment that another source of mercury on the Gulf Coast is oil well drilled.
Yes.
The barite that's used to lubricate the oil.
Yeah, so.
And the fish, because of the importance of those rigs as fish.
And just oil, production in general is now known to be a more important source than it was before. Globally, it's not as large as those other two, but it's still getting to be. In fact, so there are people that are looking into estimating how much is coming from oil production. Did you have a question?
Yeah, so is prop wash from motorboats and wake boats in the shallower bodies of water or the shallower areas of water stirring up the muddy sediments into the water column? Is that a problem?
Yeah, that's a good question. Certainly I know from our studies where you have areas that there's a lot of resuspension, it does make the particles that have mercury in them more available to the biota that are going to take them up. But on the other hand, it also oxygenates those areas too more, so maybe it would reduce the amount of methylation. I don't know about that, but certainly it does make available things that are in the sediments that have methylmercury in them. Yeah. So we, for many years, and then we worked in estuaries in those very same salt marshes that Jason, I never saw a body though, thank God for that. And we worked in salt marshes too, because those are areas where there's a lot of anoxic, sediments and areas for methylation. We learned a bunch of things there. That's where we kind of learned that it's really the things that eat in the water column rather than the benthos that are higher, have higher mercury. We also know that the fish, your average fish when you're fishing in lakes, the ones that have that eat off the bottom, like catfish, as opposed to say, walleye or something. The bottom feeders have lower mercury than the ones that are eating off of this biomagnifying, food chain. So in terms of mercury, we're really now, there's still a lot of mercury research going on. We're not doing as much, but we're very involved in the policy side of things. So as I was mentioning about the MATS rule, well, we'll see what happens with that. We worked a lot with Superfund remediation managers at EPA to help them figure out how to clean up mercury sites. And we are also, I am very involved in the Minamata Convention, which is now we're about to go into COP6, just like the climate COP. We have COPs as well, conferences of parties, that's what COP stands for. And so right now we're trying to figure out how are we going to assess the effectiveness of the treaty. Like when we get all these countries to start to reduce the amount, what are we going to measure in the environment? Do we even have a baseline to measure it from? All those kinds of questions. It's been really interesting to be a part of that, but it makes you realize how complicated it is. And it's so complicated because there's so many countries. I think at this point there's something like 142 signatory countries that have ratified the Minamata Convention. So you can imagine not everybody agrees on how we should do this. So. Okay, I'm going to move to PFAS because I've lost complete track of what time it is and how long I'm supposed to talk to you. But I have to talk about PFAS because, well, number one, it is in the news a lot these days. I don't know if you've seen it. It's not something that many of us knew about, but some of us who have been working in mercury have pivoted to PFAS because many of the questions are similar. In some ways, we actually don't know what are the kinds of systems in which PFAS ends up being high in fish. We don't know, how it actually gets transferred from one level of the food chain to the other. There's many questions. It's way more complicated. So I mentioned methylmercury and inorganic mercury. Those are the two species of mercury we worry about. PFAS has over 14,000 compounds. It's mind-boggling. At this point, most labs are measuring only 40. And that's what our studies, we measure 40 of them. But the chemistry of PFAS is so complicated, and I am not a chemist, and thank goodness for my collaborators who are organic analytical chemists, because it's not even just that we measure 40. There are other ones within the 40 and beyond the 40 that are called precursors that end up transforming after you're measuring them or before you're measuring them. And they can end up showing up as the compounds that we already know have really negative effects on human health and wildlife health. We don't know as much about wildlife health. We know much more about that with mercury, but with PFAS, we're really at the human health end of things. So where mercury was a neurotoxin, PFAS, it's all still emerging. PFAS is for sure a carcinogen. So there is testicular cancers associated with it. There's kidney dysfunction, liver cancer. There is effects on the developing fetus. It also crosses the placental barrier like mercury does. It has immunological effects. One of our colleagues at Harvard did a study with a population that they've been studying for many years, and during COVID, they realized that the COVID vaccine given to people who had higher PFAS in their blood did not ramp up as an effective immune response. So it has immune function effects as well. I have a colleague at Dartmouth, Megan Romano. We have collaborated on research, and they're finding birth weight effects on newborns. There's just so many things. There's obesity. There's some relationships with obesity as well. And with 14,000 compounds, who knows? And these compounds, even the 40 that we study, I was looking at the list the other day because I was writing a proposal. One of these compounds are so complicated. They're all written as acronyms, like it's an alphabet soup. 40 of them is enough. One of them that has an acronym that's like 8 letters long. The actual chemical is 44 letters long. So it's just mind-boggling. And so it is fairly complicated for someone like me, for sure, but it's also pretty complicated even for the chemists, and especially because we don't know what most of them are. And the only reason we measure 40 is we have standards for which we can measure 40 of them. We don't have standards for all of the rest. So the important thing here with PFAS is, where is it coming from? And you would be amazed, because all you have to do is to go home. And if you have ski wax, the block kind, look at your ski wax and look at what it says on there. Ski waxes, boat waxes, floor waxes, all have them. Any products that actually are stain-proof, waterproof, solar panels have it. All of our waterproof rain gear has it. For now, except for those oil, those old-fashioned oil raincoats. When we go out to collect samples, we do not wear rain gear, no matter what, even if it's raining, because we cannot be contaminating our own samples, right? It's in a lot of medical devices and technology. So it's such a different kind of contaminant, unlike pesticides and PCBs, where we know where it's coming from. It's like for agriculture, or it's for industry, but this is us. Our consumer products have PFAS in them, and I've told my kids this: do not be eating microwave popcorn, because the liners of microwave popcorn bags have PFAS in them. A lot of food wrapping materials have PFAS in them. And the fact of the matter is, right now, so they've stopped manufacturing about 4 of the different compounds that they know are associated with some of these human health outcomes that I mentioned. But there's lots that, We don't know about any of the others in terms of human health effects. And if you try to ask a manufacturer if they have PFAS in their product, because I don't want it in my lab, they don't know. I tried to buy paint to repaint the inside of one of our incubators. And we called around everywhere, and nobody could tell us if there was PFAS in these paints. So it's really difficult. But because we are partly the source, one of the places that PFAS actually accumulates and is accumulated and then discharged, some of it, is wastewater treatment plants. So wastewater treatment plants are actually now kind of sources to water bodies. And actually, so I have a study that's going on in Great Bay, New Hampshire. I don't know if many of you have been to the coast near Portsmouth. And Great Bay has something called the former Pease Air Force Base. That actually, like many Department of Defense facilities, is contaminated with PFAS because of aqueous foam, firefighting foams, essentially AFFF is what we call it. And that is all PFAS. So those foams that are really important for putting out petroleum-based fires are still used because we don't have a substitute for it. And so Pease, that use of those AFFF foams around that base and around many bases has seeped into the groundwater. And so it has contaminated drinking water. And that's what has actually raised the awareness of the public, because many drinking water sources have been contaminated, groundwater sources. And I think we were just talking about, I think it's Woodstock. There's been several schools where all they did was they were using floor wax, and then they washed the residue down the drain, and it contaminated the groundwater system for those schools. So it's just, when I've heard people speak from EPA about this, they say things like, oh my gosh, I've been working on contaminants for 30 years, but I have never come across something as pervasive as this set of chemicals. So, yeah.
I was going to ask, I'm not sure if it's under the same umbrella, but I was reading recently about, like, so many of us are wearing sports bands, and the conversation about looking at what the components are of the sports band, because you're wearing them so close to your body, 24 hours a day, leaching. And then the other one, again, I'm not sure if it's the same umbrella, but the conversations about, like, women's or men's exercise wear, running, the lycra, the tighter kind of compression garments that you'd wear while exercising, and some leaching from some of the...
I think, not that I know for sure.
Could you repeat that?
So the question was whether exercise clothing or athletic wristbands might have PFAS in them. I think really the things that that are allowing us to have waterproof substances. So I'm sure we don't really even know, but I think that if it's waterproof, rain gear, then it will have it, and maybe less possibly those other things, because it's the stain-proof. So your stain-proof carpeting has it, for sure. Your stain-proof upholstery on your couches, your furniture has it, for sure. Scotchgard is PFAS. It's kind of like everywhere. And yeah.
So does that transfer to us from cloth or from?
So those are the sources that end up transferring to wastewater treatment plants. But I should say that they have measured, there was an NGO out in Seattle where they started to take air measurements of PFAS in a shopping mall, and in Dick's Sporting Goods, it was higher than out in the main part of the mall. So we also know that it volatilizes too. So I'm not saying that someone that goes to shop at Dick's is going to be, getting a dose that's really harmful, but it is just incredibly, and so we also know, just like mercury, that it is atmospherically transported. So when we find these kinds of contaminants up in these really pristine areas, you know that it's been transported there, right? So, and so,
Sorry, I'm so sorry. I know that you're talking about how it's everywhere now. Do we know how long it's been everywhere versus how recently we started noticing that it's everywhere?
yeah, so good question. Started manufacturing, so 3M is the company that made it and created it in the beginning. So that was in the 1950s or so. So it's been manufactured and put in the environment since then. Later in the early 2000s, they stopped making certain compounds, PFOS and PFOA. I don't know if you've ever heard of these, but part of the alphabet soup. They still persist in the environment, but then they started to switch to different compounds that were, so there's this thing with PFAS of long chain. So what PFAS is a chain of carbons bonded with fluorines attached to the carbons. And the fluorines attached to the carbons, that bond is incredibly strong. And that's what makes it so persistent. And so, but longer chain PFAS actually tend to, well, more of the long chain PFAS were found to have these human health effects. And so they stopped making the ones that had 8 carbon chains. They went to ones that had 5 carbon chains. Well, lo and behold, they found out when they switched that they actually also have human health effects. So it's the whack-a-mole thing, right? You just keep trying to knock down this one, but another one is popping up. Yeah, Tom?
2 questions. One, you mentioned Teflon, which suggests that heating some of these volatilizes them and puts them in the atmosphere a little more accessible. But do fungi and microbes will
Break them down?
just about anything?
Yeah.
And is much known about the potential for these things to be decomposed over time?
Yeah, really good question. So I am funded by the DoD to do some of this research, and the DoD is funding so much PFAS research. But one of the things they fund a lot of is remediation. And so one of, among the studies that they've been funding is microbial breakdown of PFAS. And there are studies, but it's very much in the research, end of things right now. Certainly, I'm sure there will be. There are other ways that they've also figured out how to chemically, like sodium hydroxide added to certain PFAS can break it down. Sometimes you need huge amounts of temperature, high temperature. One of my colleagues, my collaborator at Clarkson, they're using sort of electrical currents to break down PFAS, but this is all very much in the research phase, trying to figure out how do we get rid of it. And it's only the most common ones, right? I just said there are over 14,000. Each of these studies will have to go through and figure out, does this work for the next kind, all that kind of thing. But as far as, so I was saying earlier that we have known about it, but there was some work done by 3M in the, I think it was the 90s, where they actually got blood samples from a lot of people from outside of Minnesota, where 3M is, and they did measure PFAS in all these blood samples from all these people from all around the country. And now there's been more of a study done by, it's a data set called NHANES, which is a national data set. CDC collects those data and those samples, and it's something like 95% of people, so most of us in this room have PFAS in our blood. And there's no other reason that we should have PFAS in our blood except that we've been exposed to, these contaminants. So, yeah.
So how do we avoid it?
Yeah, how do we avoid it? It's a good question. Well, I guess, so right now, drinking water is the biggest. If you live in an area where there is drinking water with PFAS in it, and I don't know if you've heard, but the EPA recently set their maximum concentration limit, very recently. That limit for PFAS is barely above our ability to detect it. But we know from human health studies that that level is just not okay for drinking water.
Can it be filtered out of drinking water?
Yeah, so those places that have contaminated water have been putting in these towns, you know, because it's the groundwater, they have been putting in filtration systems, very expensive ones. It can be removed with activated carbon, just like many of our other drinking water contaminants. So it can be removed, but at great cost. And so people have been, so number one is, the sad thing is it's really expensive to get a sample run. It's $500 to $600. And it costs a lot on analysis. But it is, if you suspect at all that you might be in an area, say near a fire station, or near places where, you know, PFAS sources might be. Like, I mean, I don't know about wastewater treatment plants. I can say this, I mentioned about Pease Air Force Base. We have sampled all around Pease, and then we've also sampled up at the wastewater treatment plant outfalls. We get sediments and water and animals. And what we're finding is that the outfall areas of the wastewater treatment plants are just as high as the area next to Pease Air Force Base. So, I mean, there's a paper that just came out literally this week about drinking water and PFAS. Yeah?
Yeah, the problem with the contaminant is there isn't a specific treatment, and treatment is good preventative care to monitor for kidney and testicular cancers. So it's a catch-22. You can find out you've elevated PFAS, but there is no individual treatment.
No, truly. Right. There's no, like with metals, you can chelate them, maybe. You know, not at this point in time. And can you imagine? So I went to this meeting this past year where a farmer, so I don't know if you've heard, but up in Maine and many states use sludge from wastewater treatment plants and spread it on fields as a form of fertilizer. And in the state of Maine, they do that, have done that a lot. It was totally acceptable to do that. It was a great way to reduce costs to municipalities. Well, some of those farms now have been found to be completely contaminated with PFAS. And there was this young farmer who had bought this farm. It was going to be an organic farm. He and his young family were farming this farm when they came to find out that they had PFAS in their groundwater. They had been drinking it. Their blood levels were through the roof. I mean, this was a scientific meeting. It was like practically we were all crying. It was so tragic. So I think, and also I talked to my friend who's a toxicologist at the Maine CDC. He said that the fish in the streams next to those fields and the deer that are on those fields are also contaminated with PFAS. And so they then put in place regulations about hunting and fishing in those areas. I have one other, yeah.
Are you recommending, I've seen the maps in New Hampshire about PFAS in well water, and they're erratic all over the state. So that one well will be fine and then 5 miles away it won't be fine.
Right.
Are you recommending people on well water test for PFAS?
Well, I'll tell you that I don't know if it's true anymore, but the state of New Hampshire was paying for people to have their water samples analyzed for
Well,
free.
they have this map of wells
Yeah,
all over the state.
yeah. I mean, it is all around, but it is dependent on the way groundwater moves as well. Or like we have 5 lakes that we've been sampling down in southern New Hampshire, probably maybe ones you've been to, and the places, the lakes that have really high density of houses and septic all around them appear to me to be the ones that have high mercury, high PFAS. And in fact, the state has already changed the fish consumption advisories on those lakes because PFAS is actually high enough that mercury is, if you eat less fish because of PFAS, you'll already be protected from mercury. Most New England fish consumption advisories are driven by mercury, but now we're seeing that some are trumped in a way by PFAS. So yeah.
What about swimming in those lakes?
Yeah, that's a good question. I kind of think that, so I don't think that unless you're drinking a lot of the water like you would out of groundwater, that's an issue. The fish are potentially an issue. And with these 40 compounds, it's the short chains that tend to be in the water and the longer chains stay in the sediments. That's some of the stuff that we're learning. I mean, as a scientist, it's fascinating, but it is really, yeah, so I don't think water exposure or absorption across skin is an issue, because it's really if you're drinking a lot of water from that groundwater. Yeah.
How about the plastic water bottles that you buy? You know, you get your little thing of water to go.
Yeah,
What is that?
I have never heard, that has other issues, like the BPA thing, but I haven't heard anything about PFAS being in those. I should say that both New Hampshire, Maine, and Vermont all have either in process or past PFAS consumer bans. And that's another way to try, one thing is I have learned so much about PFAS. I mean, and it is just becoming more informed, and I only know about this because I go to meetings where people talk about, the people who are trying to push through the Maine consumer products ban. Vermont is still in the process. New Hampshire, I think, is already past that. So where there are products that are known to have PFAS, they want that to keep those out of the state. It's a start. I mean, really what we have to do is stop manufacturing it, I mean, and we have to figure out alternatives for the things. So one of the big areas that the DoD funds is alternatives, replacement for AFFF foams, because that's like such an important, it's a public safety issue, but to this point, they do not have a replacement that's as effective as the AFFF foams. So anyway, Jason, I can keep talking, or?
There's a couple questions.
Yeah, any more questions? I could talk forever. Yeah, Tracy. Is there any good news? There's a lot of money. If you want to study PFAS, write a grant now. I don't know. I've been saying to my lab that, mercury money has diminished, right? We know a lot about mercury. We're in this policy side of things. I feel like there's so much scientifically, with 14,000 minus 40 compounds yet to go. I think there's still a lot that we don't know, and all the transformations, and yeah, it's huge. Yeah, Susan.
Celia, at BCE, when we talk about should we be looking at PFAS in wildlife, one of the things that on the argument against it is like we'll find it everywhere we look. So what's the point?
Yeah.
What's your answer to that?
Well, I think I study fish as wildlife. I mean, I think I am trying to figure out it's just like with mercury. What are the places that are the most exposed populations? Same with loons. When we were studying mercury in loons, which were the ones that were most, vulnerable? And if they are, then we need to think about making sure that other stressors are not impacting those populations as well. That's how I think of it, where are the places, what are the populations, so we know these lakes down in southern New Hampshire, have high PFAS in fish. What are the factors that are determining that? There are people who have been studying birds and other mammals in some of these funded projects. They're trying to figure out the toxicology of it. Like how high is too high, because they are doing ecological risk assessment. Those are important things. How much are they actually really exposed to in the wild, and what are the concentrations that really have, physiological and population level effects on them. So
ultimately, then what can we do about it?
Yeah, well, that is the source issue, right? I know. But if you saw declines in certain populations, it's like the Bicknell stress. These vulnerable populations, and we've done a lot globally. a lot. I mean, in the US, those emissions have declined, by a huge amount. So, we need to know that there's ecological risk associated with it. Otherwise, people don't care, So I think that's one of the reasons it's important. But yeah, Tracy.
So do you know anything about PFAS in building materials like insulating foam or house wrap, and then there's all those medical supplies that
Yeah, definitely.
Hitchcock is going through by the truckload?
Yeah, there's definitely
Pharmaceuticals
PFAS in medical. Oh, there's PFAS in makeup. Not that mascara, waterproof, right? Yeah, it's in so many things that you wouldn't even think about. Yeah, but medical products for sure. Sure they must be in building products, but actually I remember when I was listening to the guy from Maine who was getting the consumer products ban, he had lists and lists of, so if you go to the state, website for PFAS, they will have lists of products that have it already that they know of, but there's probably many more that don't have it, so yeah.
I'm just thinking about all the attics and basement rim joists that are
Yeah,
generally
I know.
foamed with, who knows?
Yeah, well, waterproof paints. There's just a lot, and since it's not regulated yet, really at that level, it's not like we know. I think so. The water exposure route really important. If you hear from your state, don't go fishing in those 5 lakes that we're studying because we already know there's PFAS, high PFAS in those fish. Food wrap. Let's see if I can think of them all. Beaver, Cobbets, Canopy, Robinson Lake. There's one more. Armington Mill. Yeah, Arlington Mill. Yeah.
Rivers, is it flushed through enough that it doesn't accumulate as much?
I think it probably flushes through. We haven't done so the river tributaries into the Great Bay, we definitely find it in the sediments. So where the outfall is, it's just accumulating in the sediments, but the water may not have as high because it is flushing through, like you're saying, but it goes somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, they stopped the sludge spraying in New Hampshire, because I know they used to do it all the time on the Halo.
We haven't done as much as in Maine, apparently. That's what my toxicologist colleague, who's worked for the New Hampshire DES. I'm sure if they did it before, they aren't doing it now, but think about what that means.
Because they're all up against a lot of those fields and stuff are right up against the Connecticut River.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know of anyone that's just gone out to measure in the Connecticut River. We're mostly focused on places we know, like outfalls right now. But think about what it's going to cost to ship that sludge for towns. We've been visiting a lot of sewage treatment plants because we've been sampling at them, and these guys don't know what is going to happen, right? Because the cost of getting rid of that is going to go through the roof. So,
Where do they put it? Do the agriculture on those sites, they can no longer farm it?
correct. So those farms in Maine are no longer being farmed. And where will they put them? They'll have to put them into like hazardous waste, disposal kinds of places. Yeah.
Plants take it up, or is it just like the soil?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm trying to think. I haven't really seen that much on plants, actually. I don't know. I'm sure there's somebody doing it out there, but since I'm so focused on water and things in the water, but yeah. I mean, I think phytoplankton, that's a plant. It takes it up, for sure, because it's actually getting transferred up. So it also can biomagnify, but it actually biomagnifies even more to organisms that are air breathing, like birds, like marine mammals, things like that, so for some reason, anyway, that's what I've been reading. Yeah, so it's a wicked environmental problem. So I'll leave it on that.
How about a huge thank you, Dr. Chen? Please feel free to stick around. Inside your menus, you'll see that Putnam's hosts a tremendous number of events, and the event calendar's in there as well as online. If you're interested in storytelling, Jam on Thursday nights hosts an impromptu storytelling event.
Yeah.
Great to check out. No script, not scripted. Just show up and tell a little story.
Where?
Right, Jam's
Down the
international
street.
headquarters.
You know where Tucker Box is?
We're
right next to Tucker Box. That way. One of those things.
Yeah, Thursday night, Jam impromptu storytelling event. Show up and tell a story. Thank you very much for coming. Next month's speaker is Dr. Jordan Forville from Appalachian Mountain Club, speaking about microbials of fungi in forest ecosystems and the importance of those fungi. Love to see you folks again. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chen.